Hello and welcome. In this video, we will try to understand what is the difference between buffered and unbuffered queries in Dapper. So let's understand what was happening when we were executing query from Dapper. So there was one database, right? And we had our application here. And from application, we were executing the query using the Dapper. And we were getting some rows back in the response. Earlier, when we were using the query method, that was executing the query in a buffered way. So what was exactly happening when we were executing the query? It will go to the database, fetch all the rows and bring it to the app server, and it will store in some memory. Okay, so this memory is nothing but it's called buffer. Okay, so in this buffer, the result set will come, and from this buffer, the application will use the data, right? So what happened? Let's discuss again. We executed the query, we got some rows, and those all rows will come and get stored in the buffer memory, and from buffer memory, the application will use that data. Okay, so this was the buffered query. Now let's understand what will happen in case of unbuffered query. So again, we have our database, and again we have our application. We will use Dapper and request our database to give us the rows. But in this case, instead of storing the data in the buffer memory, what we will do? We will keep the database connection open and we will get the rows as and when it is required, right? So if I require row number 1, then row number 1 will come. When I ask for row number 2, row number 2 will come. When I ask for row number 3, row number 3 will come. So it is kind of, we are streaming data from database, right? By using unbuffered query, we can save memory allocation. If you want to make your program more memory efficient, you can use unbuffered query. But the disadvantage of this is we need to keep our database connection open till we complete the reading from the database. So this was unbuffered query. So let's go back to slides and understand the other differences between buffered and unbuffered query. When it comes to querying database using Dapper, there are mainly two types of queries. One is buffered query and one is unbuffered queries. As we have understood, a buffered query retrieves all the rows from the data source at once into the memory. So it will store all the rows at once and store it in the memory, and memory is nothing but a buffer. Okay, while an unbuffered query will streams the results one by one as the next result is requested, right? So it will stream the data. It will not get all the data at once. All queries are buffered queries in Dapper unless you define this attribute. So we can define buffered false if you want to do an unbuffered query. So let's go to Visual Studio and understand this with an example. Okay, so I have opened up my Visual Studio and here I have this console application, and here I have created one database connection and I have written the SQL query that is a simple select statement. I am doing a select star from employee table. And if I go to my database and execute the same query, I am getting 10 rows. So let's first understand the buffered query. As we have understood, all queries by default are buffered query. So let's say connection dot query and pass down the SQL query in this. Okay, and store the result in a variable. If you see this method right, this method is having one parameter that is a Boolean type parameter that is buffered, and the default value of this is true. Because of this, all queries by default are buffered query. But if you want to execute the query in non-buffered way, you can change that default value and set it to false. If you set it to false, the query will run in an unbuffered fashion. But for now, let's execute this with the default behavior. That is nothing but the buffered query. And let's use the generic type of this query. So I will specify the employee here. Now let's use the for each loop and iterate through all the data that we have received. So I am iterating through all the employees and I'm printing the first name of the employee. Let's run this application. and I'm getting all the employees and their first name. But let's say after executing it one time, I mean after iterating through one time, I will close my connection. So what I will do, I will say connection dot close. Okay, so what I'm doing, I'm iterating through the first object and then I'm closing the connection. Let's see the behavior in this case. Okay, you can see I am still getting all the 10 employee name here. That is because this is a buffered query. When we executed this query, the Dapper will get all the data and store it in the buffer memory. And from that buffer memory, we can access the employees object and print it. Even though our connection is closed, but still we are able to access the data because that data is available in the buffer. But let's notice the behavior when I change this query to unbuffered. So I will set the buffered parameter as false here. Now let's run the application and notice the behavior. Our application is running, and if you see on the console window, we have printed the first name John, but when we tried to iterate the second employee, the connection was already closed. That's why we received this runtime exception. That is nothing but an invalid operation exception. It says invalid attempt to read when reader is closed. So when we close the connection between the database and application was closed, and there was no data in our buffered memory because we have specified buffered as false. That's why we got the runtime exception. But if I remove this connection.close and run the application again, I will get all the employees back as expected. So this is the difference between buffered and unbuffered query in Dapper. And guys, I want to show you one more method that is available if you want to execute the query in unbuffered fashion. So instead of using the query, what you can do, you can use QueryUnbufferedAsync method. And in this, you can specify the data that you are expecting. Because I'm expecting employee type data, so I will specify employee here, and I can pass my SQL query here. And if you see the return type of this is returning us an iAsync enumerable of employee type. So we can do for each loop on this also. If you notice, we are receiving a compilation error here because this is of async type. So we need to put an await keyword here. Once I put the await keyword, the compilation error is gone. And now I can print the employee name. And now let's run the application. And I'm getting the expected result. So this is the one other way to execute query in an unbuffered way by using the QueryUnbufferedAsync method.